welcome to Dan and Julie Snippets number 2. Last week we left you with the idea that you've got expectations, then reality, there's disappointment.
Right.
All of us experience that.
Very much so.
So does that mean then, do we just need to lower our expectations, kind of numb ourselves to expectations so that we don't ever experience disappointment?
Right.
Does that become the end game to avoid disappointment?
I think that's a great question. First of all, you got to go back to, remember our vows, we said for better or worse. But when we get married, very few of us are ever formulating ideas of what for worse might possibly look like. So I think this question about, do we just lower our expectations? I know for me personally, just as I talk with women and experience in myself, this is always the tension, that we decide that that's the answer. I'm just not going to expect so much from my teenagers, or I'm not going to expect so much from my husband or my children or whatever it might be, because it hurts so bad when we have expectations and we actually flesh out that disappointment. It really hurts.
Yeah.
It feels sad, it feels heavy, it can feel really dark. And so that is not the answer. I don't think, I mean, it's a tendency, but if you look at Scripture, all throughout Scripture, it supports just the opposite. You know, you think about in Romans 8, it talks about we groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption. I mean, that's all about the tension. That's the wrestle, but then we're looking to what's coming. Even Jeremiah 29:11, for I know the plans that I have for you to give you a future and a hope, not for calamity. So he's identifying that there is tension in that gap, but it calls us to look ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned that, you know, all of us when we go through a wedding ceremony, and, you know, I've done lots of weddings,
Yeah.
and this clause is in there some way, shape, or form where you say, for better or for worse.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that.
Right.
Nobody ever thinks that worse
No.
is going to happen. But from our life experience, we've been married 37 years.
Right.
From our life experience, what is a worse
Yeah.
that comes to mind?
Right. And I know all of you could share multiple stories as well, but for Dan and I, just 2 months short of our 2nd anniversary, we got the tragic news that my father had unexpectedly died. And so that set me on a course of trying to wrap my head around the fact that as a 24-year-old, I didn't have my dad anymore, and I adored my dad. I loved my dad. So that changed the course. That was definitely a for worse, and it altered the course of how I was going to move forward in my life.
Yeah, we didn't plan it. You can't,
Right.
That's hard to prepare for
Right.
that.
You can't.
I think even just recently, you know, we've been married 37 years. Well, it was right before we experienced our 37th anniversary.
right.
On May 31st. I get a call from our son Cooper, who is a husband, he's a father of 2.
Yeah.
He tells us he's had acute kidney failure. Well, that's life altering. This is going to be part of his story.
For the rest of
So
his
that's
life.
heavy. Well,
Yeah.
there's no way to accurately plan for that. You can't
Right.
prepare for those types of tragedies.
Right.
But there's got to be a way that we minimize the day-to-day disappointment.
Right.
So how do we kind of live with that tension of we've got expectations and
Right.
we want to have expectations? How do we go about
Right.
that whole juggling that so that we're not living in disappointment?
Right.
What would you say?
I think it's so important to learn this skill, and that I think as we learn the day-to-day skill, we actually become more heart ready to handle the larger for worse events that take place in our life. And so I think the key is over communication. You go back to, those of you who have been married for a while, you go back in your mind to when you first started sharing holidays with your family, or you were taking trips to visit your extended family, whatever it might be. If you didn't talk about it ahead of time, each of you were going in with entirely different thoughts about what that week is going to look like. At least we did.
Yeah.
And so we learned early on, because we would have incredible levels of tension and discomfort in our own marriage while we were having Christmas or while we were celebrating holidays, because we just simply hadn't talked about it ahead of time. So it was an easy thing to begin to learn. It's a discipline, But you have to talk about it ahead of time. Okay, honey, as we're heading to Kansas for the next week over Christmas, what are you thinking this week is going to look like? And then Dan's saying the same thing to me. And I think that's true about a date night or a weekend away or a Saturday even. What are you thinking is going to, what are we doing this Saturday? Like, can we be on the same page about that? Over communicate about expectations so we don't as often live in that land of disappointment.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, it kind of makes sense. The larger our family gets, the more variables are involved. Yeah. And that's why I've jokingly said sometimes, why be happy if you can have your own family? You know, right. I mean, that's tongue in cheek. But it's because that whole thing, we have these expectations, oh, family vacation, it's going to be easy. And then it's like, oh my gosh, this is a train wreck. Share just recently, just practically, how that looks in more of a simple day-to-day situation. We're going to Colorado.
Right, yeah. We just took 2 weeks ago that trip to Colorado, and originally we had put that on the calendar 2 months earlier as a plan to have a biking trip to kind of wrap up the summer, and thought it'd be really fun exercise, good fun outdoor time. And we knew ahead of time going into it, just by a couple of days, that the weather was going to be horrible. And it actually, the 3 days we were there, it actually didn't really get above 50 degrees. Now, it ended up being okay because we couldn't breathe while we were there.
Yeah.
We
so
forgot about
it was
the
a good
altitude.
thing we couldn't bike.
Right. We forgot about the altitude issue.
Yeah.
But it was really important because we were both disappointed the 3 or 4 days before we left for that trip. And so for us to talk about it and go into the week wondering and talking about what it would actually look like. It would mean a lot more resting, reading. We took more books with us instead of thinking that we'd be outside. It just altered the way it would look, and it ended up being a really great time, but it would have been very disappointing had we not talked about it ahead of time.
So the key, the big idea that we want you to get is, the idea is, don't lower your expectations. Yeah. That's not what we want to do. It's over-communicate about your expectations so that you don't have to live in disappointment. So that's really the idea. Yeah. Don't lower your expectations, over-communicate.
Yeah, and it can change the course of our day-to-day living with each other.
Absolutely. So, thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week.